Sysop Analysis is a technology company that specializes in data analytics and systems administration. Ove Amardeep is the company's sole general counsel. With a background in software engineering, he has a strong understanding of the industry and Sysop's product base. Richard Rademaker is the CEO of Sysop. He is the only person that Ove reports to. For the past 6 months, Richard and Ove have been negotiating a lucrative deal with HiViews, a company that specializes in drones. After attending a board of directors meeting, Richard approaches Ove to request that he prepare an advice to the board on the legal risks associated with the drone project. The board is concerned that government regulations could have a negative impact on the project. When instructing Ove, Richard says,
Ove, we've been working on this project really hard over the last 6 months. If we can pull this one off, I get paid a bonus, which I really need right now. We've basically already convinced the board to take on the project. Let's not get into the nitty-gritty of hypothetical regulations that might not even happen, if you get where I'm coming from.
Ove understands that what Richard means is to provide a high-level advice that would not raise any red flags to the board. In the past, Ove has heard from other staff members that previous general counsel was let go by Richard for not fitting with the needs of the firm. Fearing that he may lose his job, Ove is thinking of writing an advice that only tackles the current legislation, even though he is aware that there is a bill being debated in Parliament that may affect the accuracy of his advice.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's presentation on in-house counsel ethical issues. Traditionally, when people think of corporate law, they picture the typical commercial law firm representing a multitude of clients. However, around 30% of lawyers actually work in-house. This means they only work with one client, as an employee that provides legal advice for the organisation. As in-house counsel, they may also be assigned non-legal decision-making roles.
The number of lawyers working in-house is set to grow. Steve Mark says the increase is partly due to the rise in transnational legal practice, rising costs, and the complexity of professional regulation for companies. Given the growth in this type of legal career, practitioners need to be aware and know how to resolve unique ethical dimensions that can challenge an in-house counsel.
Now that you're all familiar with our friend Mr. Ove Amardeep, let's go through the ethical dimensions of working as an in-house counsel. To help us do this, we will use the REST and breaking model. We have chosen this model for its theoretical approach towards ethical decision-making and its incorporation of behavioral legal ethics in explaining the barriers to moral capabilities.
The first stage of the model is awareness. Ove needs to have the moral sensitivity to identify the ethical issues that may arise in his role as in-house counsel. What might these be?
First, after hearing Richard's instructions, he should recognize that he is being asked to work in his legal capacity. This means that there are professional rules he will need to consider. For example, he should be aware that despite Richard's instructions, he needs to act in the best interests of the client and give competent advice.
He mustn't forget who his client is. The client is the company and not Richard.
Also, he should be sensitive that his other role as a business advisor should not influence his legal services. Concerns about the duty to stay independent when writing his advice should start to come to mind. So what is it about in-house lawyers that make these ethical issues common?
The key difference is that in-house counsel have a unique level of proximity to their client. As a client is their sole employer, it's more challenging for in-house counsel to stay independent and detach themselves from the ethical norms of the company. It is particularly challenging in our case because Ove knows that there is a culture of firing lawyers who do not follow Richard's instructions.
It certainly doesn't help that in-house counsel can often take on non-legal roles in the company. In fact, it is actually increasingly expected that in-house counsel bring their skills into other roles. In this example, Ove can use his computer science background to help Richard find deals. What is important is that he is aware that by taking on a dual role, he needs to clearly separate when he is wearing his legal hat and bound by professional rules. Whilst it may be appropriate for a businessman to take risks, the same risks should not be taken when giving legal advice.
Further, Ove's ability to become aware of these issues may be impacted by barriers to his moral sensitivity. For example, Ove may in the past be used to blindly following instructions from Richard without thinking of his ethical obligations and therefore created a script which he habitually follows.
Additionally, there are workplace factors. The fact that Ove only reports to Richard and not the board may diffuse his sense of responsibility and therefore cause him to feel responsible only to Richard. This may lead him to fail to remember who the client really is.
So, do you think Ove was aware of any of these ethical issues?
It is likely he had a general awareness from his formal education and knowledge of the legal profession's ethical rules. He is perceptive enough to know that Richard doesn't want red flags raised to the board. He is also alert as to why previous counsel was let go. Based on these facts, it is likely he had specific awareness that his current situation posed ethical dimensions.
After becoming aware of his ethical obligations, Ove needs to possess the moral reflectiveness to make a judgment about the most ethical course of action. Breaky argues that this would require Ove to arrive at a judgment that accords with the spirit and letter of the law, in both an aspirational and regulative sense.
Moral reflectiveness can require a range of cognitive skills. Here, Ove would need to think critically and professionally to apply the professional rules and case law to his situation. It may also require creative thinking to uncover a feasible course of action.
In-house lawyers are subject to the same ethical rules as other practitioners. Here, there are multiple solicitors' rules that Ove needs to consider. First, he may be in breach of Solicitors Rule 4.1.1, which states that lawyers must act in the best interests of a client in any matter in which the solicitor represents the client. The company, SciSop, is the client, not individuals within the firm like Richard. In order to fulfill his duties, Ove needs to make the judgment that writing an incomplete advice would not be acting in the best interests of SciSop and potentially be in breach of Rule 4.1.1.
Second, Ove also needs to consider his duty to avoid any compromise to his integrity and professional independence under Solicitor Rule 4.1.4. He should recognise that despite holding a dual role as both business and legal advisor, he needs to maintain his independence when working in his legal capacity to draft the advice. This means that considerations about whether the board will approve the deal should not impact his decision to give a full advice.
Finally, Ove should make a judgment that writing incomplete advice likely puts him in breach of delivering competent legal services under Solicitor's Rule 4.1.3.
Unfortunately, Ove's moral reflectiveness may be affected by multiple barriers. First, Ove may have cognitive distortions causing him to underestimate the likelihood of the bill becoming legislation. As such, he may make the incorrect judgment that he has fulfilled his duties under the professional rules by omitting the bill.
Additionally, he may use self-serving excuses to deny his responsibility, such as convincing himself that he had no choice given Richard's authority and threat to his job. These self-serving excuses may hinder his ability to think of feasible options to deal with the situation in a way that fulfills his ethical obligations.
If Ove's moral reflectiveness was able to overcome these barriers, he should recognise that it would be unethical and in breach of his professional duties to write an incomplete advice. The ethical alternative action would be to educate Richard on why it is unethical to intentionally omit relevant bills and prepare a complete advice to the board.
Assuming that Ove made the correct judgment, he is now faced with the next stage, making a decision on which action he should take. At this stage, Breaky states that he would need to have the moral motive to prioritize the ethical option over the unethical option.
Moral motives are ultimately dependent on each practitioner's personal values. For example, despite his fear for losing his job, Ove may feel a sense of honour and investment in his role as a legal practitioner to the company. This desirable role identity to be an ethical gatekeeper for the company may compel him to prioritise his ethical duties and decide on writing a full advice.
Or Ove may feel that the trust and status that he is given from the quasi-contractual agreement with society and the company warrants him to act ethically and ignore any alternative motive.
However, the strength of these moral motives to compel ethical decision-making may be diminished by the strength of other interests that arise from personal desires or work culture.
Here, Ove has many other interests that incentivize him to make the unethical choice. The key factor is likely his incentive to protect his job. As a client is also your employer, refusal to follow unethical instructions could mean placing your job and livelihood at risk.
This dependence and proximity means that in-house lawyers have more at stake as compared to external lawyers when they have to decide to act against an unethical superior's instructions. Although there may be financial consequences to losing a client at an external law firm, it usually does not translate to the loss of the individual lawyer's job and livelihood.
Further, from working so closely with Richard, he may have a misplaced loyalty that overweighs his moral motives. Finally, Ove may have personal egotistic desires to facilitate the deal succeeding so he can claim attention and praise.
If Ove does not have the strong moral motives to compel him to push these alternative motives aside, he may make the incorrect decision to act on the unethical option. On the other hand, if Ove possesses strong moral motives, he will prioritize the ethical option and educate Richard and prepare a complete advice to the board.
So, if Ove decides on this latter option to properly advise the board, then good on him, and that's the end, right?
Close, but not quite. Even after making the ethically correct decision, Ove still requires the moral character to follow through with his decision. Here, Ove is experiencing external pressures, such as a desire to please Richard and secure his job, and internal pressures like a reputational boost within the company. This stage requires Ove to follow through with his ethical decision and detach himself from these pressures.
But how should Ove practically achieve this? Didn't Reiki suggest that moral character is something you either have or don't have?
To some extent, yes, but there are still techniques which Ove can adopt to develop cognitive habits to positively act on his ethical values. For example, keeping an ethics journal for reflection, or decorating his room and desks with visual reminders of the standards he wants to uphold, such as candor and honesty. Through habitual reminders, Ove can get creative in keeping ethics paramount and at the forefront of his mind.
It may also help for Ove to consider the far-reaching and long-term reputational consequences of making an unethical choice. By creating a habit of framing deliberations in the long term, he may better resist the pressures and temptations in the moment.
Here, if Ove developed the habit, he might better recognize that providing inaccurate advice will only temporarily earn Richard's favor, but ultimately jeopardize the drone project, his reputation as a legal advisor, and the interests of the company.
But what if he can't think of other points of view or has grown accustomed to deferring to Richard's instructions?
Good point. Thankfully, Ove isn't alone. He can always dial the ethics hotline or seek out a trusted confidant to mature and expand his professional ethical thinking. In the long run, these techniques can develop Ove's capacity for ethical courage to act upon and give voice to his values.
This brings us to the fifth step in Breakey's model, achievement. Even if Ove acted on his ethically correct decision, he needs the moral competence to implement his decision well.
Here, this would require good communication skills when performing his educative role as a lawyer to explain to Richard why it is unethical and illegal to provide incomplete advice. This can be easier said than done, especially if refusing to act on Richard's instructions is a foreign situation for Ove.
To overcome this, Ove should plan a dialogue tree by anticipating Richard's arguments and creating scripted responses. For example, Ove may start by raising how providing incomplete advice would be in breach of his professional duties as a lawyer. If Richard objects and seems disinterested in this consequence, Ove may use techniques such as empathy and framing to provide arguments in line with Richard's motivations.
To illustrate, Ove can appeal to Richard's personal motives by emphasizing how incomplete legal advice may lead to poor business decisions. This would not be ideal for Richard as it could impact his reputation and cause financial detriment to the company.
During these conversations, Ove would need to have strong interpersonal communication skills to remain civil yet firm in his position. Imagining and practicing specific responses will increase Ove's interpersonal confidence and competence to accomplish his chosen course of action.
This takes us to the final stage in the model, review. If Ove were to later reflect on his ethical decisions, actions, and the outcome, moral reflectiveness would once again be required to evaluate whether principled moral action was successful, and if not, what steps should have been taken.
Let's say after handing in an incomplete advice to Richard, Ove had a slow week at work and therefore had time to reflect on what had happened. By bringing a different perspective and giving greater consideration to the potential outcomes of his actions, he may come to realize before Richard has passed the advice to the board that he had made an unethical decision.
By recognizing his wrongdoing early on, Ove has a chance to correct his actions by resubmitting a full advice and going through an educative discussion with Richard.
However, even at the review stage, there are still barriers that might stand in the way of Ove correcting his actions. For example, as Ove is the only legal advisor, he likely has a heavy workload. The pressures from work and deadlines may impact on his cognitive capacity to thoroughly evaluate his actions.
Or, given the reputation of Richard to fire people that oppose him, Ove's colleagues may even praise his decision to provide incomplete advice. This might distort Ove's moral judgment process and reinforce his future actions to follow a similar script.
If Ove is able to overcome these barriers, he may be able to correct his past actions and reinforce ethical behavior next time he comes across a similar dilemma.
As we can see, there are many barriers that can hinder an in-house lawyer's moral process to make good ethical decisions. While each ethical decision is dependent on the individual's moral process, institutional initiatives implemented at the company level can support this ethical moral process.
A simple way to support ethical decision-making for in-house lawyers would be restructuring who the lawyer reports to. Evers and Harris suggests that non-lawyer employees should not be supervising the work of counsel, especially where it provides the opportunity to alter their advice.
In this scenario, Ove only reports to Richard and has little interactions with the board of directors. This structure facilitates the misplaced loyalty he may feel towards Richard, which increases the likelihood that Ove may forget who his client is. Therefore, a small change such as requiring Ove to report directly to the board of directors could enhance the ability for him to maintain his independence as a professional and keep in mind his ethical duties to the company.
Apart from this simple restructure, the company could also change its whistleblower policies in relation to in-house counsels. Here, the company should ensure that the contract with Ove should specifically recognize that, as an in-house counsel, he may be obliged to act as a whistleblower and require that there will be no recrimination in that event. By protecting Ove's job security, the company can reduce the external motives which are barriers to the decision-making and action stage. When properly implemented, this can increase the likelihood of Ove's moral process reaching an ethical outcome.
Of course, the culture of the firm is important, and policies such as these may not help in situations where the entire upper management encourages unethical behavior. If this is the case, the lawyer would have to reflect on their personal morals and decide whether this is really the type of company they want to continue their career.
On the other hand, where there is a strong ethical culture in the upper management of a company, up-down initiatives such as ethical auditing is another infrastructure that can facilitate better moral actors.
Ethical auditing is a process where the management team reviews the company's policies and intentionally seeks to make the policies more effective. It aims to take a proactive approach to control the company's ethical practices.
In our scenario, if the board of directors mandated an annual ethical auditing of the company's practices, with the help of external consultants, they may be able to detect that the reporting structure and whistleblower policies needed amendment.
This up-down approach also means that Ove and other individual employees do not need to feel the pressure of putting their job at risk by speaking up. By mandating a systematic review of company policies, other company policies that promote unethical behavior can be more readily detected, updated, and support systems implemented.
Now that we've gone through all the stages under Breaker's model and also discussed possible ethical infrastructure that could have helped Ove, let's summarize what we've talked about using Breaker's ethics regime.
Here, the demanders at the top of the diagram include the board, Richard, potential third parties working with the company, and the legal profession in general. These are the groups that exert pressure which calls for ethical norms to be set. In our case, the ethical norms relate to how in-house lawyers like Ove should act in situations presenting ethical dimensions.
Next, we have the institution. In our case, this would be SISOP Analysis, the company. Through the management team, the company can then create initiatives that aim to support the moral process of its in-house lawyers. A few support initiatives that have been outlined are to restructure the reporting chain, protect the job security of in-house counsel through whistleblower policies, and take on a management approach that incorporates ethical auditing.
The obstacles represent the barriers outlined in each stage of the moral process. For example, alternative incentives, workplace stress, and lack of competence.
Finally, we reach the individual's moral process. Ove's moral motives for desirable role identity or loyalty to the quasi-contractual agreement, along with his moral capabilities such as critical, professional, and creative thinking, can help him generate the feasible ethical option. That is, to educate Richard and write a complete advice. Together, this would achieve a principled moral action. Being aware of the unique tensions and ethical dimensions that in-house lawyers face is essential. By promoting the moral process through support initiatives, we can help in-house lawyers make better moral decisions and uphold the ethical standards of the profession as a whole.